The Protestant Reformation marked the beginning of modernity. At least, this was something I was always taught. In both the public school system and the evangelical co-op I attended later on in my high school years, the rise of Protestantism was said to have set the stage for modern political notions of freedom of conscience, the importance of the individual, and separation of church and state. When Martin Luther hammered his 95 Theses into the doors of Wittenberg, he unwittingly hammered a nail into the unity of Latin Christendom, shattering its monolithic hold on society and allowing the freedom of thought to bloom in its place. For Protestants and a certain kind of secular liberal, the Reformation is often seen as a great good. Not only did it undermine the spiritual tyranny of medieval Catholicism, but it laid the foundations for treasured political documents such as the U.S. Constitution. For a certain kind of Catholic reactionary, the Reformation was more problematic than providential, as it marked the beginning of an agonizing descent into the spiritual chaos that the West faces today. These differing views on the Reformation have renewed relevance in light of an important question the right is asking today. Should conservatives continue to support liberal democracy, or does classical liberalism only lead to a dead end of cultural nihilism and anti-religious bigotry? One way to help us think about this crisis of faith is to examine the origins of modern notions of individual rights and liberal constitutionalism. Do these ideas stem from, as liberal skeptic Sohrab Ahmari asserts in his essay Against David Frenchism, English nonconformism, another term for the Puritans, or do they stem from somewhere else? After reading Michael P. Winship's brilliant book on the history of Puritanism entitled Hot Protestants, A History of Puritanism in England and America, one gets the impression that Puritan political arrangements were not the beginning of what Ahmari laments about the modern order, but in fact were the last gasp of the very kind of politics conservatives like him want to recover. For example, the Puritans did not believe in freedom of conscience in the way we do today. The first generations of Puritans still believed that England needed a national church, but they wanted it purified of Catholic influence, thus bringing it closer in line with what they believed was the original model of the New Testament. While Puritan members of Parliament pushed for greater parliamentary power over and against the power of the Crown, this was to ensure they could impose their vision of Protestant Christianity on England, not out of a principled stance for religious liberty in general. Indeed, once Puritans gained control of the state in 1649, they attempted, fairly unsuccessfully according to Winship, to impose harsh religious laws on the country, hoping to ban any church practices that were deemed too Catholic. Across the Atlantic, Puritan republicanism in New England could be no less uncompromising. Per Old Testament dictum, the punishment for adultery was death. Sabbath laws were strictly enforced. Many of the churches exhorted parishioners to surveil each other for their sins in ways that ominously foreshadow current woke scold culture, and religious dissenters such as Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson were sent into exile. With all this in mind, however, it would be wrong to reduce Puritan government to totalitarianism. There was a measure of Republican self-government that simply did not exist in places like the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany. For example, the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Company, John Winthrop, along with his court of assistants, willingly abdicated some of their royally delegated powers to any male who became a member of a parish church in the colony. Once a colonist became a member of the local church, they would be able to vote for not only their local deputies, but for the court of assistants and even the governor himself. While Puritan church membership was highly exclusive, requiring potential applicants to be models of godly behavior, this political system was revolutionary for its time, as political participation depended on, quote, piety, not property, end quote, in Winship's own words. In fact, the Puritans strongly objected to any New England equivalent of the House of Lords, as they believed that, quote, hereditary rule and godly rule were incompatible, since saintliness did not necessarily run in bloodlines, end quote. The same Calvinism that led to the Puritans' strict moral legislation also led them to see politics as the shared responsibility of God's elect, and not the duty of an aristocracy. Puritan moralistic legislation was not always a complete failure either. In a chapter describing life inside the golden era of Puritan New England, or the mid-17th century, Winship writes that, quote, it was generally well understood that well-governed patriarchal families produced good members of churches and commonwealths, and Puritan New England tried to ensure such families with unprecedented legislative intrusiveness and zeal, end quote. For example, fathers were required to teach their children the basics of reading and the Christian faith. They were also required to make sure their children, quote, were trained in a gainful and useful employment, end quote. Winship observes that the Puritans, quote, created systems that were simple, equitable, inexpensive, speedy, transparent, and grounded in law codes crafted to protect the colonists' rights against overbearing local rulers, end quote. Although only boys were allowed to advance into higher education, both sexes were taught to read, which led to an exceptionally high literacy rate. Puritan New England contained political orders that strive for some sense of the common good, without completely destroying individual liberties or democratic self-rule. The sort of republicanism that the Puritans practiced reminds one of older, classical Greek forms of republican self-rule, the very same forms that liberal skeptics such as Amari and Patrick Deneen want us to return to. It's ironic, because in his now controversial essay against David Frenchism, Amari blames the deficiencies of conservative liberalism on nonconformist Protestant roots. But if you were to resurrect a New England Puritan and ask him to take sides in this great debate, he would probably agree with Amari instead of French when it came to the purposes of politics. To add to the irony, it was perhaps the English monarchy that was most responsible for religious toleration in both England and New England. Charles II, as a way of clamping down on the social strife caused by the English Civil War, and as a way of giving English Catholics and Anglicans more freedom in a hostile society, forced religious tolerance upon a Puritan society that really didn't want it. In fact, it was the monarchy's attempts to allow more toleration for Catholics in England that led Puritan-dominated Parliament to oust the king in the Glorious Revolution. It should be obvious that any full return to Puritan republicanism would be both undesirable and impractical. As stated above, the moral laws in Puritan republics could be unduly strict, and while women were taught to read, they were still often treated as second-class citizens. Winship notes that over time, the Puritan economy became woefully dependent on the Atlantic slave trade, and slavery became quite common in the colonies. But at the same time, we should not simply wave away the Puritan experiment in godly self-government as a bad Margaret Atwood novel. The Puritans did sincerely try to build a political order that facilitated virtuous living, while at the same time maintaining a strong system of individual rights that protected people from arbitrary power. In execution, the Puritans were obviously imperfect, but the places where they did succeed, exceedingly high literacy rates, low crime, and strong families, should give conservatives of a more libertarian bent some pause when they argue that politics must be completely agnostic in terms of higher things. It was a fuller and more mature understanding of republicanism and democratic self-rule that the Puritans tried, if not always successfully, to grasp for, and it is this understanding that conservatives should try to rediscover today.